The Martins worshipped their 3-year-old Robert and always bragged about his feats. There had never been a child as bright and creative as theirs. Then Robert did something unforgivable: he didn't get into the #1 preschool in New York. After that, the Martins cooled toward him. They didn't talk about him the same way, and they didn't treat him with the same pride and affection. He was no longer their brilliant little Robert. He was someone who had discredited himself and shamed them. At the tender age of 3, he was a failure. As a New York Times article points out, failure has been transformed from an action, "I failed," to an identity, "I am a failure." This is especially true in a fixed mindset. When I was a child, I, too, worried about meeting Robert's fate. In 6th grade, I was the best speller in my school. The principal wanted me to go to a city-wide competition, but I refused. In 9th grade, I excelled in French, and my teacher wanted me to enter a city-wide competition. Again, I refused. Why would I risk turning from success into a failure? From a winner into a loser? Ernie Els, the great golfer, worried about this too. Els finally won a major tournament after a 5-year dry spell, in which match after match slipped away from him. What if he had lost this tournament, too? I would have been a different person, he tells us. He would have been a loser. Each April, when the skinny envelopes, the rejection letters, arrive from colleges, countless failures are created coast to coast. Thousands of brilliant young scholars become the girl who didn't get into Princeton or the boy who didn't get into Stanford. Defining moments. Even in the growth mindset, failure can be a painful experience. But it doesn't define you. It's a problem to be faced, dealt with, and learned from. Jim Marshall, the former defensive player for the Minnesota Vikings, relates what could easily have made him into a failure. In a game against the San Francisco 49ers, Marshall spotted the football on the ground. He scooped it up and ran for a touchdown as the crowd cheered. But he ran the wrong way. He scored for the wrong team and on national television. It was the most devastating moment of his life. The shame was overpowering. But during halftime, he thought, if you make a mistake, you got to make it right. I realized I had a choice. I could sit in my misery or I could do something about it. Pulling himself together for the second half, he played some of his best football ever and contributed to his team's victory. Nor did he stop there. He spoke to groups. He answered letters that poured in from people who finally had the courage to admit their own shameful experiences. He heightened his concentration during games. Instead of letting the experience define him, he took control of it. He used it to become a better player and, he believes, a better person. In the fixed mindset, however, the loss of one's self to failure can be a permanent, haunting trauma. Bernard Louiseau was one of the top chefs in the world. Only a handful of restaurants in all of France receive the supreme rating of 3 stars from the Guide Michelin, the most respected restaurant guide in Europe. He was one of them. Around the publication of the 2003 Guide Michelin, however, Mr. Louiseau committed suicide. He had lost 2 points in another guide, going from a 19 out of 20 to a 17 in the Gault Millau. And there were rampant rumors that he would lose one of his 3 stars in the new guide. Although he did not, the idea of failure had possessed him. Louiseau had been a pioneer. He was one of the first to advance the nouvelle cuisine, trading the traditional butter and cream sauces of French cooking for the brighter flavors of the foods themselves. A man of tremendous energy, he was also an entrepreneur. Besides his 3-star restaurant in Burgundy, he had created 3 eateries in Paris, numerous cookbooks, and a line of frozen foods. "I'm like Yves Saint Laurent," he told people. "I do both haute couture and ready-to-wear." A man of such talent and originality could easily have planned for a satisfying future, with or without the 2 points or the 3rd star. In fact, the director of the Gault Millau said it was unimaginable that their rating could have taken his life. But in the fixed mindset, it is imaginable. Their lower rating gave him a new definition of himself: failure. Has been. It's striking what counts as a failure in the fixed mindset. So, on a lighter note, my success is your failure. Last summer my husband and I went to a dude ranch, something very novel since neither of us had ever made contact with a horse. One day, we signed up for a lesson in fly fishing. It was taught by a wonderful 80-year-old cowboy-type fisherman who showed us how to cast the fishing line, and then turned us loose. We soon realized that he had not taught us how to recognize when the trout bit the lure. They don't tug on the line, you have to watch for a bubble in the water, what to do when the trout bit the lure, tug upward, or how to reel the trout in if by some miracle we got that far, pull the fish along the water, do not hoist it into the air. Well, time passed, the mosquitoes bit, but not so the trout. None of the dozen or so of us made the slightest progress. Suddenly, I hit the jackpot. Some careless trout bit hard on my lure and the fisherman, who happened to be right there, talked me through the rest. I had me a rainbow trout. Reaction number 1, my husband, David, came running over beaming with pride and saying, "Life with you is so exciting." Reaction number 2, that evening when we came into the dining room for dinner, 2 men came up to my husband and said, "David, how are you coping?" David looked at them blankly, he had no idea what they were talking about. Of course, he didn't. He was the one who thought my catching the fish was exciting. But I knew exactly what they meant. They had expected him to feel diminished, and they went on to make it clear that that's exactly what my success had done to them.